former professional basketball player and a representative of the Basketball Players Union, what one of his passions was, and his handsome face broke up into a great smile. And he said, "It was my son's first year's birthday on Sunday, Noah." So that's one of his passions. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonas Hoffmann.
So, thank you very much for having me actually here. As was already told, I learned that I have to speak here yesterday. And I want to excuse Mr. Walter Palmer, the General Secretary of EU Athletes, who should have been here and probably would have been much better equipped to talk about this. But he couldn't for private reasons, so I stepped up and do this for him. I'm the General Secretary of the German Basketball Players Association. We are a member of EU Athletes, which is our European federation. And EU Athletes has been working very, very closely with Uniglobal Union, an international federation of trade unions. EU Athletes by now is representing more than 30 players associations all over Europe in 15 different countries and more than 25,000 individual athletes. So we have come to a point of representativity where I think we need to be taken serious. What makes us more credible is that the European Commission has agreed that we are the social partner for the social dialogue in sports, and for today's topic has put anti-doping as an issue on that agenda. So that's why we're dealing with this. What I want to present to you today, I will go back to that slide, is a study called Adverse Analyzing, which we did, and we critically took on the statistics which lie underneath the anti-doping system and which should legitimize what the WADA does. So our aim and perspective as we are representing athletes on a day-to-day basis is very simple actually. Athletes want an effective anti-doping system and clean sport. But at the same time, they want to know that their rights are protected and they want to know what they actually get themselves into when committing to that system. So what we did before writing this or researching for this study was we put ourselves in the following position. I am an athlete who was requested, asked, or forced, you can decide yourself which one fits best, to give the consent, or call it free and informed consent, to take part in the anti-doping test and system. Now before doing that, I personally, and as Mr. Bach of the DOSB would call it, as a responsible athlete, I would want to know what I actually get myself into. So I would look for information, what I can find about the effectiveness, the problems, the mechanism, the so-called, if you want to call it that way, success rate of the anti-doping system. And I would ask myself, are the infringements to my personal rights, which the anti-doping system obviously brings, are really worth that? What triggers the interest of athletes even more are these reoccurring statements like the one you see up here from Mr. Haumann, General Director of WADA, who says to the Daily Telegraph, statistically the number of people being caught is between 1 or 2%. That's the number of positives against the number of tests. But the number of people doping are in the double digits. So once again, representing athletes, talking to athletes, I would ask myself two questions. One, how does he know? And two, is that really true? So the first thing we did, we asked ourselves, is this statement of Mr. Haumann based on the reporting of the anti-doping organizations? So we took on the WADA numbers from the laboratory and ADO statistics of 2009, and we expected that those comparisons would add up to the numbers that Mr. Haumann mentioned. And you will see that overall in the world, 277,928 samples were analyzed in 2009 in the laboratories. For me, personally, that sounds like a pretty big number. Now, you look at the reported violations, and then you take your calculator because the number is not given, and you come up with 758 reported violations. And that means 0.27%. Not that much of a big number. So you can see that those don't fit. So the second thing we then did, taking a closer look at Europe, we wanted to see how it looks there. So as there is no European anti-doping agency, what we did, we gathered, or tried to gather, all the annual reports of anti-doping organizations in Europe. There are overall 49 countries which fall under Europe in the WADA system. And we try to collect those reports which they're actually obliged by the WADA code to prepare, publicize, and transmit to WADA so they can publish them as well. So the first thing we found, and you can see that with the numbers up there, the reporting system is a mess. You can find only 20 out of the 49 European NATOs publish a report. 17 of those actually have real data that you can look at, and only 11 of those are submitted to WADA. So some other 6 are somewhere left behind. When you take on those numbers and compare those to the others, you come up with a 1% violation rate. And interestingly, for whichever reasons, which probably signifies the uneven playing field that we're working in the anti-doping system, 207 of those 445 violations are in Belgium. I don't know why, but you can do the math yourself, what that means. So those are the general numbers, but we went some steps further and looked into some specific issues, what we can take from those numbers. And one thing, I'm personally a former basketball player, and there's actually, at this point, not much doping happening in basketball. So for me, it's always a very interesting question. Which sports actually make up those numbers and those violations? And we found that only 5 sports, and I guess most of you would have expected some of those sports out there, make up for almost 50% of all the violations. Not much is left after that. You can see the sports yourself. I don't have to get into those details, I think. The next thing we did is we looked at substances and the types of violations that came up. And you can see a very high percentage of cannabinoids, which go under non-performance enhancing drugs, which then you can argue about whether they're even in that system. Another very large part is due to what I would call technical violations, like multiple missed tests or multiple failures in the ADAM systems or refusals. Another thing we did, we looked at in-competition versus out-of-competition efficiency. And that, again, from a basketball perspective, is a very interesting question, because with very little doping happening in our sports, still the German national team players are part of the ADAM system. So they are visited at home and being tested at home. They have to give all their private information into that system. So as you can see, the out-of-competition, according to those numbers that we were able to gather, which I'm sure from the numbers you saw first are not all the numbers that are out there, but those are the ones we could gather. Out-of-competition is a lot less successful in terms of catching cheaters than in competition. So I would ask myself the question, why do I have to let those people in my apartment and give them all these information if, one, in some sports, it appears that there's nobody cheating, and 2, it appears that it would be much more effective to test me during practice, during games, and so forth. So we very critically investigated if this is a very strong invasion, and I think we need to think about very critically if all sports actually need those out-of-competition tests if the success rate is so low. Next thing was the efficiency of NATOs. Very, very interestingly, we just looked at if there's like an average of how successful the NATOs work, and you can see that the numbers are, they're going way apart. And interestingly, I will not say anything about that either, just give you the number. Germany is the least effective. So I guess we're pretty good on deterrence, or I don't know. For some reasons, they're so low. So we came up with some recommendations, very general. The WADA code requires ADOs to publicize and create those reports. The WADA code also calls WADA itself a clearinghouse. So we need those numbers. I mean, there's no way of not getting those numbers and having a fundamentally transparent system. So we need to have those annual reports, and WADA needs to enforce getting those. Second thing, as I told you, the reporting is very, very chaotic. So we need to develop reporting formats which are the same for everybody, so you can actually read the data that you're getting. We need to take a hard look at out-of-competition and in-competition testing, if that's really effective the way it is. We need to make sure that we have a risk analysis for different sports, team sports over individual sports. You know the differences yourself, and be very, very clear about which sports are highly affected by doping, not so highly effective, and be proportional there. And probably we should think about the inclusion of non-performance enhancing drugs as cannabis and ask ourselves the question whether it's really WADA's job to deal with this rather moral issue than a doping issue. These are some recommendations on this specific part of reporting. When you spend a lot of time on those numbers, on those reports, and at the same time you look at those fundamental right issues that you're having with the system, you find very clearly that there is, at this point, no balance between the ineffectiveness of the system and, on the other hand, the infringement of the fundamental rights that the athletes have to endure. And this should be a serious concern for everybody talking about the WADA code revision process. And I can tell you that athletes are generally willing to take some infringements to their rights if they know that what they're doing is actually worth proving a clean sport. But if you can't prove that, then there is no right in the world to take athletes' privacy, intimacy, health information, and more if they can't even prove that what their sport that they're playing is actually clean. So from an athlete's perspective, the system looks a little bit like this. The system is not effective. I think we can all agree on that. I think Professor Simon is going to tell you some very interesting facts about that as well. At this point, it is not effective. The system is very invasive and stressful to athletes. Free consent is not free. A European directive and German data protection law says that a free consent means a free choice and informed about all the consequences of giving that consent. The only choice an athlete really has is, do I give up my job or do I give my consent? And that is not free consent as it is supposed to be by law. We have some problems with the laboratories over the last little bit. I want to quickly touch on the Diana Taurasi case, a professional basketball player, female basketball player, okay, from the US. She played in Turkey, and she was tested positive with an A sample. The Minister of Sports stepped in and said, we know when A samples are positive, B samples are as well. The B sample proved to be not positive, but it was publicized, and she was in the media, and it hurt her very much. I guess I will jump the Germany part now, because I'm running out of time. But you can ask me questions about it if you want. The title of the panel is Which Reforms Are Most Urgent? I will give you a few bullet points. I talked about the balance of infringement and effectiveness. That's a key point for me. We need to set the system on a solid legal basis, because in Germany I think we're now very, very sure that there are so many legal loopholes in the systems that could eventually tear the system down. And we want a stable system, but we need to set it up on a solid basis. We need to respect and protect fundamental rights of athletes, because there's no way around that. We need to strengthen the participation of athletes in the system. Athletes need to have a mandate, talking about things, deciding on things. We need to check on everybody, not just the athletes. That's been mentioned before. The entourage, as Mr. Nigley said, is at this point not really researched or detected at all. We need to change that, and we need to have a better sense of proportionality. I want to stop or end with one short statement. Sport has always held high moral values and being a role model for society. And I'm very convinced that we cannot try to save the fair play and those values by treating our athletes in some ways worse than prisoners and denying them democratic values and fundamental rights. Because I'm asking you, if we do that to the standouts, the idols of our children, what example does that set to our society? Thank you.
That's what we come to play the game for, isn't it? That's what we're here for. Bit of roll up the sleeves debate. Right. I'm really looking forward now to the debate. We've got a perspective that doping among athletes barely gets above 0.25% of 1 percentage point. Dr. Perikles Simon of the Johannes Guttenberg University here in Germany in Mainz, the title of his presentation is Doping as an Epidemic. Steps towards a more adequate treatment. I talked to Perikles before, and he said his passion was actually playing basketball with his children. As a tall man, I presume he beats them regularly. Thanks. Welcome to the thing, Perikles. Really looking forward to this. Please. Round of applause, please.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm also very much looking forward to start a discussion with you. So I will speed through my talk a little bit because some points have already been mentioned by the speakers before. And I will particularly refer to Mr. Hoffmann's talk because there are some nice points which fit together from his talk to my talk. And what you can see, I first of all want to present you some data and also some findings about the prevalence and about the epidemiological features associated with doping. Then I want to talk about the aggravation of doping. Are we on a highway to pandemia? And I want to talk about the treating of the self-fulfilling prophecy of sports. So this is, if you ask me for my opinion, what I would call doping. And then I would say now sports, because that's for sure, that we continue, but how to play the game. And then we start with the discussion. So my first point is that we may have different views in the fight against doping. When we are specialists, we could say, well, I know what we cannot detect so far or which is not tested for, as I learned today. Mario Thieves already has a testing procedure developed for IGF-1. Insulin, for example, we can detect a lot of different insulins, but not a real human insulin version. Also, we have to take into consideration that there was a recent publication by Mr. Essendon who nicely showed that you can still dope with EPO and that there is no chance to detect this doping with the blood passport system, which I think explains a lot. Because if we look at the public perception, what does the public notice? Well, they notice they have, the integrated math system in their brains when they watch competitions. I mean, some of us are sport fans, so they watch the competitions, and what do they see? They see a drop in the performance over 5,000 meters from 13:20 to 13 minutes within just 4 years. And then you see a kind of stagnation. With EPO tests being performed starting 2000, it was initially a rise of this average time run by 20, the best 20 athletes, and then it goes down again. And then WADA puts down a novel detection procedure, and then you have the rise again, and then it goes down again. So, I mean, this is so obvious. You don't have to be a specialist to see and understand that there is something wrong going on. And now we know you just have to go to Florida and train there, and then you will have a drop of 1/10 of a second over 100-meter dash. I mean, this is really amazing. This is the average of the top 20 sprinters, and this year was amazing with the World Championship going on. In the first years, when IGF-1 hit the market in the US around 2005, we just had a little decline of this, but then I can tell you the decline is now not only due to 4 athletes running the 20 fastest times, it's now almost 20 athletes that run this time over here, and you don't need to be a prophet to say, why is this the case? Yeah, is it a novel training procedure or something? So this is the perception we have. So what do we have to, or what could we learn about doping and its prevalence? Is it really a disease to the world of sports, often mentioned? I had to learn that even in the 70s and 60s, there were smart and clever people who said, well, no, it's not a disease, it's a highly commutable epidemic. And but how to prove that actually? Because and it's important to prove it, because we could just go on with detection and treatment, just like we do today, in case it's a disease. I would agree, well, you know, there is one sheep and it's black, okay, we can find this sheep, we can isolate this sheep, and we don't have a problem anymore. But if you have a black sheep, and it's like an automatic process that they all turn into black sheeps after a while, because there is like this drinking station over here, yeah, which does the trick, you have a problem. And it's not going to work that you just detect and treat. Have you ever heard that an epidemic has been stopped because of detection and treatment only? No. There are different ways how we have to tackle such a problem. So we need to learn what is it like. And what do we have to take into consideration to decide, yes, it is an epidemic and not only a disease? Well, an epidemic occurs with a frequency much higher than expected in certain populations. Also, we would say there are exogenous factors like exposure to a pathogen. In this case, it would be intensity, frequency, duration to a doping challenge. If you are an elite athlete, you will be confronted with doping practices maybe, and maybe over many years, and someday you may become weak. This would be like a pathogen, if you ask me. And potency of the pathogen would be the question, well, is there a gain by taking the doping substance? What you can see here is the women's shot put top 20 average, and it increased by 4.5 meters within 10 years. And then there is this kind of stagnation when in competition came into place, but there is no drop of the performance. But what you can see here is an increase in variance. Yeah? So the variance increases, and I can show you this for many different sports. And then something interesting happens. It's the out of competition testing coming into place in 1988. And as Mr. Hoffmann indicated, it seems to be inefficient because there is almost nobody detected, but you can see there is a drop now in the performance level, in the average, and more importantly, from an epidemiological point of view, the variance goes down. So there is not this up and down anymore. It's like a more stable situation here. And this is indeed a sign that we have a first treatment that is effective. But whether it really does the whole trick is another question. I would doubt it. So when we had a look at these epidemiological systems, then we first of all gave it a look at the level of the recreational sports, and we can say we have a lot of dopers there in fitness sports. It's like 13.5%, and you don't need sophisticated techniques to discover them. If we apply such a system to our German elite athletes on the junior level, 16 years on average, you end up with a doping prevalence of about 7%. So if you use the sophisticated method, you can also apply this to adult elite sports, of course, and I'm sure we will end up with more knowledge about doping and its prevalence than we would ever get from testing. And I'm afraid that the figures will be very, very disparate between those two procedures. And I can show you, let me shortcut this. This was just to show you that in recreational sports, it's an epidemic. We can easily show it. But how about the elite sports? And so far, to my opinion, the best report I've read about dark figure of doping was by Zotta et al. It's not an old one, it just came out a few months ago. And he said, well, the average in athletics, IAAF athletes that are under the control of the blood passport system, the average of blood doping is 14% among those over 7,000 athletes. So, and that's just covering blood doping, nothing more. Not steroids, not everything else, not growth hormone, anything else. And this is really a surprise. And of course there were differences between the countries, but I skipped this at this current point. What we can say that it's definitely higher than expected, and we don't know how big this iceberg is going to be under the sea. But we know the tip of the iceberg, which is just the blood doping, and that's a real threat to athletics still. And this system, it's interesting to understand, you cannot detect a single doper on the individual level with this procedure. It will only give you a very, very profound estimate of the population, of the whole population of the 7,000 athletes. But I don't care. Nobody cares in academics, because the important point is to show this is the dark figure of doping, here's the problem, we have to tackle it now. So what can we do? We can try, well, that's another hint from the elite sports, but Mr. Nigley nicely pointed to that we know that athletes like Marion Jones, they abuse the whole procedure of different doping substances for many years, and indeed there is kind of an aggravation of doping among the elite athletes, and we have to come up with the notion, well, most probably we need an anti-epidemic approach, but how is it supposed to look like? If we know that we have the Goldman's dilemma, that 50% of the athletes would accept death in 5 years if they are unbeatable due to a magic drug, then we know we have a real problem. And this point is not shared by the general population. Only 1% or less than 1% would agree on that. So how does the anti-doping fight work today? What we know is that there is a shift in doping substances. They have been taking AAS, then they took testosterone with other substances combined, so this is kind of an aggravation if you ask me. So even with EPO, now they take EPO plus transfusion because they know that they can escape the blood passport system if they do double doping. That's an interesting point. So all we see is aggravation. And let me come to the point of gene doping. I'm very happy that WADA actually skipped this third point that many pharmacological substances were put into this section, because it doesn't make sense at all. Because if you ask me in terms of the aggravation of doping, gene doping is really a major problem because of 3 points. And they are not shared by pharmacological doping. The first is it is related to the genetic enhancement debate, which is still taking place, and we don't know which direction this debate is going to take for many different disciplines in clinical medicine. It's supposed to be undetectable, but this is most likely solvable. Our group, but also a group of French and American researchers made a suggestion how to detect it. Biosafety concerns is the major issue. The point is with gene doping that it can escape from the athlete to the audience, to other to spectators, to other elite athletes that have not been doping, because typically viruses are used to perform the gene transfer most efficiently. And this is an example from old days. It's a monkey who lived for 7 years in this example, and the research has been started in 1997. And this monkey is still alive. I just asked the researcher recently. And what you can do with this monkey is you just give a little bit of antibiotic. These are the triangles down here. When you give the antibiotic, and then EPO goes up and the hematocrit goes up, and then you have to take blood to stabilize the hematocrit again, but then it turns down, it goes up again when you take the antibiotics. So an elite athlete who's doping with such a procedure would just need to travel with a little bit of antibiotics, and he could be doped all over the year, and it's going to be hard to detect this. Well, this is an example very recent from the New York Times, what the technology of gene transfer is able to do principally. I think it's right now the best example how cancer has been fought by gene transfer. But what are the researchers doing? They take the HIV and they integrate DNA that is able to fight tumor cells, and with this HIV virus they infect T cells that have been isolated, immune cells isolated from the patients. They give these T cells back to the patient, and the T cells are going to fight the cancer, and they are really melting down the cancer within just a few days. These patients have been untreatable by conventional methods at this time, and it just took them 20 days to wipe out the cancer, and they are now disease-free for more than 1 year. The bad news is other cancer types like colon cancer cannot be treated this easily. It will eventually kill the patient. And that's why you see that such procedures are powerful, but they are also dangerous. And all of these patients have to stay in isolation in order to do all the treatments, because they are infected with viruses, and potentially they could infect you or anybody else close to them. And so what I have to say, if we keep on the doping fight, and I want to add to Mr. Hoffmann's figure, the 0.2%, Mr. Striegel and I, we had to report on them and had to give these figure also for a journal which has been asking us. They said, well, show us the official figures, how they developed in the last 20 years. And we figured out the last 20 years, it's always 0.2 and something % of dopers detected. So it is if there is no doping at all, or in other terms spoken, if you are familiar with the movie Casablanca, it's like we arrest the same number of athletes every day. Yeah, like Humphrey Bogart says, oh, just arrest the typical number of suspects. Yeah, that's what we actually do right now. And why are we doing this? I think it's pretty placative just to look at the plain figures, at the numbers, at the money. If it's $6 million we spend on developing new detection procedures or fighting doping in any way with new technologies, could also be a prevention program, because there is almost no money to develop prevention programs, except if you apply at WADA. An estimated 130 billion US dollar is spent in a year in elite sports, and we have 350 million for tests, and their infrastructure to maintain the infrastructure is 50 millions. To do all the testing is 300 millions. So I think that's just aggravating, if you ask me, doping in athletes. And what could we do? If we have this hen house of anti-doping and it's guarded by a fox here, we may not be able to really effectively fight doping, because on the other side you see what athletes have to carry, what they have to balance. It's billions of dollars. It's the audience at the end who balances the whole system, but with this structure you are not going to make an effective fight against doping, especially not if the fox is still looking at the gold and it's so shining, so nice. I don't think it's going to work. So to the very last slide, to give some suggestions. Prevention directed to the athletes, almost impossible given the Goldman's dilemma, but prevention in the working place should be highly interesting. But what would we need to do this? I mean, we would need to go to the origin of transmission. If it's an epidemic, we need the origin. Who is the origin? The physicians, the trainers, the sports medicine person, the managers, corrupt insiders. We need to know it, and we need to fight them. And we need to spend money on this. I want to see the money that is spent on this and not on detection or anything. If it does not work, we have to spend the money otherwise. Also, education control, structural changes, sanctions, isolation, CI policies, conflict of interest. I mean, we need conflict of interest policies in the very different NADOs and NADAs, no question. And the route of transmission, I think there we need to do a lot, and it's quite comparable. Thank you for your attention.
Right, let's take a 5 minutes break, and then I'm going to bring some more people up to the panel, and then let's get the panel going. This morning we had a fascinating debate about gender roles in sport. Most of the questions, I think, with the exception of one from our colleague from South Africa, were asked by men. So please have questions ready, because I will be picking people out of the audience to ask questions, even if you aren't standing up. See you back here in 5 minutes.